Chapter 5. A Timely Rescue. The next day Hans heard Topol bark and went to the outside passageway to see what was the matter. No one was in sight except Martin, huddled in a corner with the dog. "What are you doing hiding there, and with the dog?" Hans asked. "I'm just petting him." "But why in a dark corner? Let's go out in the courtyard. Topol's making too much noise." Outside, Martin slumped on a stone bench. Topol, with drooping tail, waited until Hans told him to lie down. "Martin, what's the matter with Topol? Did he eat something that didn't agree with him?" "I guess so." Luncheon hurried out. "Did anyone see a letter for Father? A messenger left one, and it has disappeared. I found some scraps of paper in the passageway, but of course that couldn't be the letter. Father gets so many letters he could fill a big room with them. He said so." "So what's one more letter?" Martin asked. "It has the names of some preachers who are coming here." "If the letter is lost, how did Father know it came?" Hans asked. "Because the messenger came back for an answer. Did you see it?" "No." "Did you, Martin?" Little Martin hung his head still lower. "No," he mumbled. "You're acting so odd," Lenchen exclaimed. "I don't think you're telling the truth. Stop patting Topol." Lenchen took the dog's head between her hands. Martin looked away. "What's that black stuff on your hands, Martin?" "Why, it's ink. Now I know what those scraps were that I found." Topol chewed up the letter. "Martin, you were teasing him with it, weren't you?" "Maybe." "Martin, you'll have to tell Father what happened." Martin jumped up in alarm. "Oh no, Lenchen, don't make me." "Father forgives people who confessed, just as God does. You'll have to go." She gave him a little shove. "Well, I'm going to take Topol. He's got to confess too." In a little while Martin came back with a big smile. Topol was wagging his tail. "Father forgave us both. He says God tells us he is going to punish us, but if we will cry and run to him, he will rescue us and comfort us. But Father didn't even punish Topol and me." Later, Lepus, Melanchthon, and Jost Jonas came over to play. Hans told his friends about the letter. "Then let's have a disputation," Lepus promptly said. "What's that?" Martin was suspicious. "Well, it's where you have two sides. One side argues for something and the other against it. There's an officer in charge to keep people from fighting," Lepus explained. "Your father has been in lots of them." They all went to the empty lecture hall. There was a table with elaborate carvings at one end for those who would do the arguing, and a tall chair for the officer in charge. Lepus sat in that chair because he was the oldest. After Jost questioned Martin in a corner of the hall, he and Hans took their places behind the table below Lepus. "Master Martinus, step forward," Lepus said. Martin did not move. "Martinus, hurry up," Hans said. "Do you mean me?" "Yes. Who else?" "But that isn't my name." "Yes, it is. It's the Latin form." "Oh." Martin stood in front of Lepus. Motioning with his hands, Jost began his plea. "Martinus Luther, the younger, claims that the dog Topol did jump upon him when he was handed a letter by a messenger. Said dog barked and yipped. Aunt Lena von Bora came along with Margaret and Paul Luther both crying, and besought the said Martinus to take said dog out of the house. There was too much noise already, she claimed. What with students coming in and out, servants running back and forth doing their work, and babies crying. To coax, said dog. Martinus dangled the letter in front of Topol's nose. Topol thought it was play and wrestled with said Martinus Luther, the younger. In doing so, the letter was torn to pieces. My defendant is innocent. I rest my case. Then it was Hans's turn. This dog Topol is famous for his mischievous tricks. Luncheon laughed. I thought this was a disputation. Lepus pounded his gavel. Women have to be quiet. Mother isn't, Luncheon began, but stopped when Hans glared at her. Said dog Topol, being one of God's lower creatures, Hans continued, could not withstand the natural order of things and did seize and chew the letter. My father says you don't tell a pig you must eat, for it eats without being bitten. An apple tree bears fruit without my telling it to. Therefore, a dog will chew letters if given the chance. It was not a matter of right or wrong, it's just his nature. A feeling of triumph welled up in Hans. He enjoyed speaking at the mock trial. Maybe I'll study law someday, he thought, and pushed back a twinge of guilt. Father didn't like lawyers. Disputation, according to him, was only threshing empty straw. Who had the best argument? Lepus asked. Luncheon voted for Hans. Martin voted for Jost. Very well, the case is closed. Lepus banged Father's gavel on the lectern, stepped down, and shook hands with Martin. Topol wagged his tail. Students started coming into the lecture hall. It was almost time for one of Father's classes. Hans led the others to the courtyard. They sat on a stone bench near the water pump. "Your father doesn't have to pay any tax on water, does he?" Jost asked Hans. Lips answered for him. "No, and neither does my father. They're famous." "What does that have to do with paying a water tax?" Jost asked. "Because hundreds of students have come here to study with my father and Hans's father. The students have to eat and sleep and buy things. The shopkeepers are happy. The innkeepers are happy. Everybody is happy. The town council decided no more water tax for us or for the Luthers." "I'll bet the council didn't like it when the people used to cross the border into Saxony and spend their money on indulgences," Jost said. "They did it even when they were going to your father's church," he told Hans with a sly smile. Hans knew enough about indulgences to know that father did not like them, but he wasn't at all sure how people bought them or what they got for their money. He did not want to show his ignorance before Jost. "Oh, father knew all about that." "No, he didn't, or he wouldn't have let them stay in his church," Jost retorted. "My father told me all about it. Those people would go look at a hair of Mary's head, or a piece of straw from the manger, or some bread from the Last Supper. Then they paid money and their sins were all forgiven." Hans's curiosity overcame him. "How did they buy indulgences?" Jost swelled with importance. "First, there was a procession with a big cross. The indulgence letter was carried on a velvet cushion with lots of gold embroidery on it. Someone would tell people to put money in the coffer, and then their dead relatives would be released from purgatory. My father told me all about it." "My father told people if they were sorry for their sins, they didn't have to pay any money," Lenchen said. "Just the same, some people have done it," Jost insisted. That night at bedtime, Hans asked Aunt Lena why some people thought they could pay to have their sins forgiven. "There will always be some people who believe they can pay for God's favor," Aunt Lena said. "But it was on exactly that point that the Pope became angry with your father." She told how father had written out 95 ideas about why indulgences were wrong. He had them printed on a large sheet of heavy paper. Then, about noon on October 31st, 1517, he and a companion walked to the castle church and posted the paper on the door. "What does posted mean?" Martin asked. "He took a big hammer and a nail," Lenchen told him. And he pounded on the old church door," Martin sang happily. Aunt Lena told how the Pope called father a wild boar and ordered that his books be burned. On December 10th, 1520, father and some students threw a letter from the Pope into a bonfire in front of Elster Gate. Then the students held a parade with a trumpeter blowing loud blasts. The next day in the lecture room, with over 300 people present, father spoke German instead of Latin and said he hadn't meant for them to have a demonstration. Your father didn't like to see students do things like that. She told how excited people became over father's ideas of faith in God. Everything father wrote was published by printer after printer in various cities. People read, thought, and discussed father's ideas. Church officials called father a heretic. They wanted to burn him at the stake like other martyrs. But father had many influential friends. They demanded that any charges had to be presented in an orderly way through disputations. "That's what father did at Worms," Hans said. "Yes, the church officials wanted him to take back everything he had been writing and preaching. In the spring of 1521, your father entered Worms, guarded by 100 horsemen. People crowded the streets that afternoon and even climbed on roofs to watch your father arrive for the meeting. Inside the building, Spaniards, Italians, Danes, Poles, Hungarians, and a French envoy waited, as well as an English ambassador. Did they all know about father?" Lenchen asked. In December 1520, father and some students threw a letter from the Pope into a bonfire in front of Elster Gate. Aunt Lena nodded. Your father's books had been heaped on a bench. He had to answer 2 questions. Do you here publicly admit that you wrote these books? Do you still believe what you wrote, or do you confess you were wrong? What did father say? The children chorused together. First, he quoted from the Bible, Whosoever shall deny me before men, him will I also deny before my Father which is in heaven. Then he said he needed time to answer the next question. They gave him until the next day. When he came back, the torches were already lit. What for? Hans asked. For the procession. Everyone expected him to admit he was wrong, but when the official asked him if he wished to confess, your father said, Show me my errors from the prophets and the Gospels. Correct me from these, and I will gladly confess my error and be the first to cast my writings into the fire. What did they say? They refused to discuss the Bible with him. And then, your father said, Unless I am convicted from the Scriptures, because I cannot believe either the Pope or the Council alone, I am bound by my conscience and the Word of God. Therefore, I can and will confess no error, because to act against one's conscience is neither safe nor sound. Now comes the exciting part, Hans said. He had heard many house guests talk about what happened next. The church officials wanted to condemn your father, but they were afraid the common people would start a riot, so they told your father to go home. On the way, a group of armed horsemen dashed out of the woods near Eisenach and surrounded the wagon. And then they dragged father out, Hans said. Let Aunt Lena tell it, Lenchen insisted. Your father snatched up his Hebrew Bible and his Greek New Testament. The horsemen cursed him and made him run alongside the horses. When they were out of sight of the wagon and the other people, the men gave your father a horse to ride. They traveled for many hours up a winding road to Wartburg Castle. The drawbridge was lowered. Hans von Berlepsch, the captain of the castle, received him. Your father was taken to 2 small rooms which could be entered only by a ladder. At night, the ladder was removed. Your father grew a beard to disguise himself. He was known as Junker George, guest of the castle. Of course, he couldn't wear his monk's robes. Instead, he wore the clothing of a knight. And he stayed there until he translated the Bible, Hans said. Nobody saw him except the page boys who brought him his meals. Martin was staring at Aunt Lena and Hans with sorrowful eyes. Didn't anyone like father? They did like him. That's why they put him in a safe place so none of his enemies could hurt or kill him, Aunt Lena explained. You see, notices had gone out that no one was to help him or give him food. Anyone who did would be fined heavily. So that's why your father's friends put him in the castle. The story excited Martin so much that he jumped on his wooden horse and ran circles around little Paul, explaining that he was going to rescue him. Paul burst into tears. Hans remembered another time when one of the children had cried for a long time. Father had said, "What have you done that I should love you so? You have disturbed the whole household with your bawling." On another occasion, when the children had quarreled and made up, Father said, "Dear God, how pleased you must be with the life and play of such children. All their sins are nothing else than forgiveness of sins." When Hans slipped into bed that night, he recalled hearing once how Father, before his marriage, had gone a whole year without making his bed. His straw mattress had rotted, but life at the Black Cloister was different now. Mother had rescued Father just in time.